We're still in Chapter 3, and now we're going to be in Section 4, discussing balancing fitness and fatigue and how that should be considered when building your bodybuilding program. So first off, to better understand why more is not always better, which I covered in the last video, it's important to understand both things that you get from training, both the fitness it produces and the fatigue it produces, how those interact and the resultant effect on performance. So essentially, a sports science concept which is useful to know from a conceptual standpoint is what's called the two-factor model, or the fitness and fatigue model. Essentially, this can be thought of as an equation, a simple one, that when you take your fitness and you minus your fatigue, that gives you your performance. And while that seems very straightforward, ultimately, these two values change a lot, and they change dependent upon how you train, the time frequency in which you train, your training age, and many, many other factors, all related to volume, intensity, frequency, and then everything on the recovery side of the equation. So while this may seem like a simple equation, what you actually experience in the gym and whether you're progressing or not, or think you're progressing or not, is going to be involved with these complex fitness fatigue dynamics. So let's talk about these three aspects of this equation. So first off, there is fitness. That is simply the adaptation to training. When we're talking about bodybuilding training, this is the simple act of you getting bigger. But it's not just that. Because again, remember, this is about performance. So the fitness that we care about is going to be what impacts our ability to perform our bodybuilding program. So there's other things in addition to increased size of your muscles, such as your ability to buffer pH and crank out more reps when you have metabolic fatigue. Even mental adaptations that allow you to train closer to failure without form deviation, staying in the pocket, as my good colleague, Coach Jeff Alberts would say, for example. So ultimately, fitness is the adaptation you get to training. Fatigue is the immediate kind of response to training that doesn't immediately result in the adaptation, but might eventually. So this includes just the stress from training. So the muscle damage that you'll incur, which will reduce force production over subsequent days until you fully repair it. The immediate metabolic response to training, which impairs your ability to keep performing reps and will create not only metabolic fatigue locally, but also systemically if there's enough cardiometabolic fatigue. You'll see reduced force output, like I mentioned. You'll also see mental fatigue, where you're just struggling to stay focused. And essentially, there's a lot of things that go into a fatigue, but ultimately, it reduces performance. And performance is exactly that, fitness minus fatigue. And that's what you actually see in the gym. So the fitness fatigue model, while relatively simple, is also layered on the background of everything in your environment. This is what's known as the biopsychosocial model, meaning that we can't just boil everything down to a simple spreadsheet, what you eat in the kitchen, whether or not you slept, and then see a very predictable outcome in terms of performance. Everything else goes into this as well. Did you have a fight with your significant other? Were you stuck in traffic for a long time? What were you watching on social media immediately before you stepped in the gym? We have research showing that all of these factors can actually impact your performance and therefore your long-term adaptations. So while we understand that performance is fitness minus fatigue, we also have to have the context that we exist in a world full of variables and we can't control them all. The fitness fatigue model and the resultant performance outcomes are changed by many factors. Importantly, as relevant to this course, how you set up your training. So balancing volume, intensity, and frequency, those interdependent variables that I talked about before. The exercise selection you choose. Are you choosing exercises which are more stressful or less stressful to get to those volume targets? Also, are you taking deloads? The act of taking a microcycle or a single week of training and making it purposely easier to actually reduce fatigue while maintaining your fitness so that you can progress and see that performance go up. Also, where do you place your days off? For example, I was a personal trainer for many years, and when I trained people who only came to me to train 2 or 3 days per week, we almost never needed to take structured deloads because they had 5 or 4 days per week where they weren't training at all. They had more time spent not training, or days in the week at least, than they did training. However, once I started becoming a bodybuilding coach, where most of my athletes were training 4, 5, or 6 days per week, and they were pushing themselves near to failure with the highest volumes that they could handle productively, and they were getting stronger and using heavier loads, and also they were doing things nutritionally which sometimes stressed them, now we'd start to see fatigue accumulate. And that's one thing that's important to consider about the fitness and fatigue dynamics as well. You may be increasing your fitness, but if your fatigue is going up at a rate that actually exceeds those fitness improvements, you'll actually see your performance plateau or even go down, which is why things like strategic rest days, good organization of your day-to-day program within your microcycle, and deloads can all be useful to ensure that you get as much productive training as possible rather than fatigue mounting so much that you can't induce progressive overload. So all of these factors are very important. We're going to be discussing them in program design, but ultimately, when you have a well-balanced program, you're going to see performance go up over time. However, it will be messy. That doesn't mean it'll go up session to session. It doesn't mean it'll go up week to week. It really depends upon your training age, the setup, and also the type of program that you're using. Some people use programs that have high fatigue dynamics, so they take more frequent deloads. Some people have a more moderate program, and they're accepting slightly slower but more predictable growth. And the decision to do either one is based upon you, your training age, personal preferences, and also your history as to what works best, and also your mentality. But ultimately, if you zoom out enough, you should see that you're progressing your performance over time if you are actually making gains, not just in the weight room, but also in your physique. Because again, if you are training for a long period of time and you're not seeing any change in performance, even if you're getting a pump, even if you're getting a burn, even if you're feeling soreness, that doesn't necessarily mean you're being objective about your progress, which is what this course is about. So, take-home message, when you get fitness and fatigue dynamics right, you should eventually see an improvement in performance. It may not show up right now or session to session, nor should you expect that. But when you zoom out far enough, you should see that squiggly line is eventually going up. Finally, we will say that it is okay to train really, really hard and actually see your fatigue dip. It depends on whether or not that pays off in the long run. And you may have heard the terms overtraining or overreaching. And those are also some things that you need to understand so that you can better understand how to program. Overreaching simply means that you've pushed yourself hard enough to where fatigue has actually dropped your performance. Not necessarily to the point where that's extended so long that you can no longer generate fitness. If fatigue actually prevents progressive overload, you will regress. And that's what's called either non-functional overreaching, or if it extends for a long enough period, overtraining. Now, fortunately, overtraining is extremely rare to the point where it's never been observed in the resistance training literature, because the volumes that we deal with as bodybuilders, powerlifters, and people who just simply lift weights don't compare to that of team sport athletes or the endurance athletes where this has been observed. But the definition, in a sports science sense, of overtraining is a period of months where not only has performance plateaued, but actually regressed. And even when you pull back, it does not return to baseline fully for many months. Again, almost never happens in a resistance training sense. You're more likely to get injured before that occurs. But what does occur quite frequently is both functional and non-functional overreaching. Now, functional overreaching is when you induce a high amount of fatigue through very hard training with either high volumes, high intensities, or both, and then you see your performance go down because fatigue is so high, and you perform a deload or you perform a block of training that's designed to reduce training stress to let fatigue dissipate, and then you see your performance come up beyond baseline. Ultimately, you actually see performance improve. So you chose to overreach, but the outcome was a net positive. You actually improved performance because of it once you dumped that fatigue. Non-functional overreaching, on the other hand, is the same dynamic, except, however, when you pull back, when you do that deload or when you take a mesocycle or a microcycle of easier training, you don't actually exceed where you were before. You pushed it a little too hard for too long, and you were actually degrading your ability to induce fitness adaptations because you were so fatigued that even when you dumped that fatigue, you weren't able to progress. So obviously, the approach you want to take is one where, if anything, you're only reaching a state of functional overreaching. And that's not a bad thing. Functional overreaching is totally fine, and it may occur. And it's much more common when you get to higher stages of your career, where you have to produce a pretty large stimulus if you want to see an outcome, at least in the short to medium term. So sometimes for advanced lifters, you might find yourself redlining it a bit more, knowing that a deload is coming. But that's not necessarily required at the novice or intermediate stage. So to recap, functional overreaching, not a bad thing, but ultimately the goal is balance. We want to make sure that we balance fitness and fatigue as appropriate for our lifter experience, resulting in improvements in performance once we get fitness and fatigue balanced. And that's a place where deloads can be useful, but also just appropriately structuring your training.